everyone. Thank you so very much for participating in our last virtual series for the summer on speech and language developmental milestones, where today we'll focus on children between the ages of 4 and 5. Again, my name is Meredith Rose, and I am a pediatric speech language pathologist, as well as the owner and founder of Home Tele SLP. So during today's presentation, there will be several areas of speech and language development that we will cover. And these areas vary based on the age of the child. So when children are younger, there are certain developmental milestones, for example, that they should be reaching when it comes to feeding. And when they're older, they've already mastered those skills earlier, so they're not something that we're going to cover as much today for a child between the ages of 4 to 5. But we're going to start by distinguishing the difference between speech and language. We'll talk a little bit about the prior milestones that should have been attained for a child between the ages of 4 to 5 in the area of feeding. We'll touch on speech sound acquisition, discuss pronouns, morphology, the mean length of utterance, pragmatics, which are social skills, literacy, so think of language literacy, reading, concepts, vocabulary, questions, and listening. So I want to begin by talking about the difference between speech and language. So a lot of times, if you have a child, for example, who receives speech language therapy services, oftentimes some parents may shorten that title and say the child's speech therapist or the child receives speech therapy. But generally speaking, speech and language therapy is involved depending on the child's area of need. And speech differs from language because it is focusing on sound production. For example, how we say sounds. It can also focus on the fluency of words that are spoken by a child. So maybe if they're having disfluent speech and they're stuttering, speech is an area that is being targeted to work on their speech fluency. Another area under the umbrella of speech is voice. So if a child has a harsh or raspy voice, perhaps due to allergies or other environmental factors, then their speech is impacted due to that. So language, on the other hand, is different because it involves the words that we use, how we share ideas and get what we want. And a person with a language disorder may have problems with understanding spoken language or even language that they're reading that's in print, talking with each other or talking with others and having conversational speech. So think of social skills. Perhaps there's a processing disorder that impacts their ability to communicate effectively. Reading and writing also fall under the umbrella of language, because those language skills are used to help when reading. And same with writing. Expressive language is also done through writing. So in addition to that, nonverbal language occurs. So think of body gestures, body language that we use, facial expressions, even sign language. So there's also a nonverbal component to language. While touching on these two things, speech and language, I also wanted to share the importance of hearing screening. So during childhood, especially very, very early on when a baby is in the womb and they're growing, one of the first things we do, or I'm sorry, not we, but an audiologist in a hospital setting would do is test the baby's hearing to see if they're hearing well. And hearing screenings are vital for early identification and management of hearing loss. So even after the child leaves the hospital, when your child is having perhaps an annual exam, you'll see from time to time that their hearing may be tested. So knowing if a child has a hearing disorder is helpful in ensuring that they're also receiving speech therapy services if there is hearing loss, so that their speech sound system is developing appropriately and their intelligibility of speech is as high as possible. So the next area that we're going to touch a little bit on is feeding. And again, as I previously mentioned at the beginning of the conversation or the presentation, is that feeding is an area that consists of milestones that are achieved earlier. So you can see here that there are some milestones that a child will typically achieve between 24 and 36 months. And so at this age, 4 and 5, a child should be able to drink fluids that are thin, like water, without choking. A child should be able to, hold a cup and and drink it without having to have some type of sippy cup on the sippy cup spout on the top of it. Maybe they're learning how to drink through a straw. And so at this point, they're also able to eat foods that are different textures, things that are chunky, things that are not only smooth, but things that they have to bite that are harder. So the texture varies in terms of what they're eating and drinking. So they shouldn't be having any issues there. And if there are some issues with feeding, I just want to mention that you definitely should communicate that with your child's pediatrician. And as we go through some of these other slides, if you find that maybe your child has not yet reached some of the developmental milestones and you do have questions or concerns, definitely share those with your pediatrician. And also, if you had specific questions related to speech and language, you can reach out to me to schedule a free 30-minute consult, and my information will be at the end of the presentation. Eden, thank you so much for sharing that you are a child care provider for children ages 3 to 5. So here are some pre-linguistic or early speech development milestones. And as you can see, phonation is an early one at stage 1. Stage 2 is what we call cooing and gooing. So babies are playing with vowel sounds and starting to use some consonant vowel combinations. And then at stage 3, the exploration stage or expansion stage, they're starting to gain better control of their voice box, their laryngeal area here, and the throat, and their articulatory mechanisms like the tongue and the teeth and the lips. And they're just starting, teeth. They don't have teeth at 4 to 6 months, but that is part of the articulatory mechanism. So like think about their tongue and their lips and being able to have more control over their jaw movement. So these things are leading to them being able to blow raspberries, and they're able to repeat or reduplicate some vowel sounds. Maybe they say ma, 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 or ba, 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 or da, 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 because it's so much easier for them to get those bilabial or lip sounds produced. They're at the front of their mouth. The lips are easier to bring together and produce sounds. And so the next stage after that is the 4th stage, which is canonical babbling. And so again, they're using more of these CV syllables, and it sounds kind of like adult speech where the timing, it's kind of like rhythmic, and it sounds like they're trying to communicate. So you're seeing more use of consonant vowel combinations. Their vowels are changing and shaping into other vowel sounds. And so they're progressing in that way. And then when we come to stage 5, which is variegated babbling, this is around 10 to 12 months. Child is continuing to use these different consonant vowel syllables. They're producing, again, adult-like intonation in terms of like the rise and fall of their voice and the rate that you hear these different combinations being used. And they're frequently using consonants like you see listed on the last line that consist of the N sound, D, B, M, T, G, S, W, N, K, and that J is a Y sound, and P. All of those sounds are frequently used consonants that are starting to develop. And again, this doesn't mean that every single thing is being hit within this time frame, but you're starting to see pieces of it, if not all of it, to develop. So here we have a chart. This is by Sanders, and it's an older chart from 1972. And it shows the speech sound acquisition in terms of phoneme, or what we call speech sound development. So phoneme development is speech sound development. And I kind of alluded to this on the last slide, and you'll see that as the chart, if you're looking from left to right, as the chart is progressing in terms of age range from left to right, so starting around the age of 2 and it leads up until around the age of 8, you'll see that there are certain sounds that a child should have in their speech sound repertoire at the age of 2. So if you thought about what we talked about a little bit earlier with the variegated babbling and the reduplicated babbling that babies do, like pa, pa, ma, 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 ba, 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 they're producing these early developing sounds that involve the lip. So P, M, even H, N, a tongue tip sound, W, W, a lip rounding sound. All of these sounds are early developing. And if you notice when you're producing them, they're in the front of your mouth and you can easily feel your lips moving or see how that sound is produced. And then as they get a little bit older, they're starting to develop what we call velar sounds, or the letters K and G. Those sounds for K and G are K, G. And so they're able to produce those back or velar sounds, as well as some additional tongue tip sounds. We call those alveolar sounds. Letters T and D make that T and D sound. And then we have the NG, and that's called ing, ing. And so ing, which is at the end of every verb that's present progressive, ing, that is also developing a little bit after that. Then the range is a little bit wider. So some kids may develop these sounds early on, and maybe they are approximating the sounds that you see, meaning maybe they're not 100% accurate, but you can tell what sound they're trying to make. So I'm going to stop at the 4 to 5 range. You'll see the sounds that come in later. If a child is having difficulty, for example, producing the F sound or the R sound or the L sound or even S's or S blends and all these other sounds that follow, those are later developing sounds. So it is normal, it's developmentally appropriate for a child to have some difficulty with those later developing sounds. And some of you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, my child can produce quite a few of those sounds and they're already, 4, almost 5 years old. And I see that these sounds don't come in until maybe 6, 7, or 8 years of age. Again, some sounds may come in early, some sounds may come in a little bit later, but in terms of a child who's 4 and 5, they should definitely have the sounds that you see in the 2 to 3 range and the sounds that you see that are in the 2 to 4 range. These are sounds that they should have. Even down here, this 2 to 6 year range, children should have these sounds. The F and the Y, they may still be working on developing that sound at the age of 4, but they should also be able to produce these sounds as well, F and Y. So anything below that, the R, excuse me, L, S, and the ch, z, and this J is a Y. So yeah, voiceless TH, like in this, that, those, I'm sorry, voiced and voiceless TH, and the j sound, ZH, these are all later developing. So please don't be too alarmed if you have a child or student who is still having difficulty with those sounds. Let's talk about when processes or speech sound errors, phonological patterns, should be disappearing by the age of 3. So there are certain speech sound production errors that are developmentally appropriate, and we're going to talk about several of those. And you'll see the word processes used. So when you see process or processes, we're talking about this pattern of sound errors. So let's look at just a few of them. We'll start with the first one. So that process that we see at the top is called unstressed syllable deletion. And what's happening is when the child is producing this type of process, they're getting rid of, dropping, omitting the weak syllable in the word. So here's an example. And the word banana, instead of producing that first syllable, ba, which is the weak syllable in that word, they're dropping it. And it sounds like they're just simplifying the word to nana, right? It's easier for them to produce oftentimes a 2-syllable word versus a multi-syllable word consisting of 3 and more syllables. The more syllables, the harder it is to move across those syllables and sequence the consonant vowel combinations in order. And so that is not uncommon for a child to take a multi-syllable word and shorten it into a 2-syllable word. The next one that we see underneath the process of unstressed syllable deletion is final consonant deletion. And that one may seem very self-explanatory, and it is. It simply means that the child is omitting, deleting, or leaving off that final consonant at the end of a word. So here we have the example of cat. The word cat becomes ka when a child uses the process of final consonant deletion. And so this can be other sounds as well. It can be leaving off any final consonant, not just the letter T. So then as you look down, you can see that there are additional examples of these processes, and I'll just give a couple more examples. So we have a question in the comments. Is this to say omitting or deleting the final consonant at age 4 is okay? So this is to say that these processes that you see in this chart should actually start disappearing by 3 years of age. So at the age of 4, the child should be able to maintain that final consonant from the production of the sound in the beginning of the word to the production of that final consonant at the end of the word. Good question. So if this is a child who is 4 and they're still omitting this sound, this is something that you could, make a note of. And if your child is in school where speech services are provided, share that concern. But you can provide me with more context by reaching out to me, and I will schedule a consult with you if you'd like more information on sounds that should be in your child's repertoire. So the next one that we're going to review is called reduplication. And this consists of a child repeating phonemes, which are speech sounds, or syllables. So let's look at the word bottle. So instead of pronouncing the T in the middle and the L at the end, the child actually shortens it by reduplicating the first 2 sounds. So like the consonant B and the vowel A, ba, baba, it becomes baba instead of bottle. So you hear a lot of young toddlers still using some of these reduplicated syllables, which is totally normal for their age. But again, by the age of 3, all of these should be changing into the correct form of the word. So once a child is 4, they're 5, they should have mastered, we say master, to indicate that the child is no longer producing the errors. So they should be able to master these processes. Let's talk about ones that continue beyond the age of 3. So since we're talking about 4 and 5-year-olds today, these are processes that you will still see your child produce. So for example, Dr. Chessie, this is a chart that shows the processes that your child may still be working on, and they may still have when they're producing sound. So these errors may still be happening. So cluster reduction, for example, is when a child will omit or delete or drop off one or more consonants in a sequence of consonants. So I think of, for example, the word spy. Maybe SP, being able to produce the S and then transition to a P sound, 2 different placements, teeth together, lips together. Maybe they drop the S and they say pie, and they say, I pie a bear, I pie a cat, but they're really saying I spy. But because of them still using that process of cluster reduction, it sounds like pie. And the example in the chart is clean. So if you recall from earlier, the letter L, or the sound for L, the phoneme ul, is produced later. And so a child may not have the ability to coordinate movement of their tongue to produce that sound at the age of 4 and 5, and will still be producing it in a way that it's substituted for another sound, or maybe it sounds approximated. But in this case, with cluster reduction, they're completely omitting that sound. So clean sounds like keen. And I'll just skip the next one, epenthesis, and go to gliding, because this is a very common process that we see in children who are still around the ages of 4 and 5. And that is when they will substitute the W sound. So in brackets, you see the W, and that is saying the sound for W. So they'll substitute wa, or they'll substitute, you see the J in brackets, that's actually the ya sound. So they'll substitute wa or ya for another consonant. Perfect example, ours. I know many of you have probably heard a child attempt to say the word red, the color, R-E-D. And how does it sound? Does it sound like red? Sometimes it does, but when they have this process of gliding, this gliding process that you're using, it actually sounds like wed. Oh, look, wed car, look, mama. And so what you're hearing is the use of that process that we're referring to that's called gliding. So in the example in the chart, run sounds more like one. Oh, I won fast. I won fast. And they're really saying, I run fast. And I'll let you read through some of the other ones that are on the page. But an example of one that's really common is stopping. And stopping is when a stop consonant, so for example, the letter D, it's used in place for fricative sounds. So like S sounds and F sounds for letter S and F, those are fricatives. It can also be used in place of liquids like our L's and our R's, nasal sounds like our M's and our N's, and glides. So in this example, you'll see that the letter S is being replaced with the letter D. And so sun sounds like done. And that process is considered stopping. And then we have the last one, final consonant devoicing. I'm going to skip the one before that and just kind of really hit on some of the more popular ones, or common ones, not popular, but common ones that we see in children, is when they will devoice the final consonant in the word. So certain sounds have, they can be voiced or unvoiced. So for example, K and G, they're produced in the same place. They're a velar sound produced in the throat area. K, G. Those two sounds are in the same place, but when not voiced, K, K is a voiceless sound. You hear K. When G is not voiced, is what I meant to say, you hear K. But when we voice the sound, G, that same placement is there, but we're putting voicing on it. So K and G are in the same place. So if a child is devoicing, that G sounds like a K. So in the word bag, for example, the G becomes a K. And instead of saying bag, they would say back. So there are just a few examples of what that looks like, or what it sounds like when a child is using those specific processes. So let's talk a little bit more about phonological patterns. You'll see in this chart the likely age of when the patterns should be disappearing. Now, again, this is not a hard and fast rule. Every child is different. How they develop their sound repertoire and the rate at which they acquire sounds is different. And so we're just going to go through a few of these and talk about when the process should be disappearing. And I see a comment or question in the chat. How about being able to sound G, but can't produce it in words? So when it comes to speech sound acquisition, when we work on sounds that we're acquiring, starting at the individuals or the sound level of the, not even a word, starting with the sound and then moving to syllable combinations like putting the consonant and then a vowel behind it. For example, go, gay, gee, guy, goo. So what I would do when a child is starting to produce a sound in isolation, there's the word I was looking for. So the letter G, Dr. Chessie, is being produced in isolation by your child. So he can say, I believe it's he, forgive me if I'm wrong, but your child can say G, but it sounds like you're saying they can't produce it in words. What I would always do is start with the vowels. So I would do A, E, I, O, and U, or use A, E, I, O, and U to combine with letter G. And I would basically draw something on paper or print something out and have like an illustration with a line going to the letter. So maybe their favorite character is here with the letter G, right? And then we have A, E, I, O, and U. You can even trace their hand and make it that simple. So on a sheet of paper, trace their hand, put the letter G in the middle, and then at the top of their letter, at the top of their fingers, write A on the paper, A, E, I, O, and U. And then practice tracing up with just their finger on the paper. G, A, G, E, G, I, G, O, G, ooh, and then try blending it more. I was kind of doing that in the beginning, forgetting that I needed to isolate it just for this example. So maybe instead of doing G, A, it becomes more like G, A, G, E, and you're kind of sliding into the sound, if that makes sense. I hope that's helpful. So looking at this chart, we're talking about speech sound acquisition still and phonological patterns. These are Examples of words and the processes that are happening when you see in the example, for example, Matt is becoming bat. So we have a bilabial sound, and a bilabial sound or consonant, sorry, b. And so what's happening here is the nasal sound M is being denasalized and it's becoming a B. So changing a nasal consonant to a non-nasal consonant. That should disappear around 2.5. Assimilation is when, for example, in the word cat, it's becoming tat. And if you notice, the C became a T, but there's also a T at the end of the word, right? So that child is taking another sound that's in the word and moving it to another place. And so we call that assimilation. And so they could either be changing the phoneme so it takes on the characteristic of another sound in the word, or they're actually like using that exact same sound. So cat becomes tat. That should disappear around the age of 3. I'm going to skip affrication and hit some more common ones. Final consonant deletion, we talked about that one earlier, omitting the consonant at the end of the word. So in the example cats, it becomes cat. That also should be disappearing by 3. Fronting of initial velar sounds. So we talked about how velar sounds are our back sounds, like letter K and G, K, G, G. And so in this example, so can becomes tan. So they're taking the back sound, the K or C sound, K, and they're producing a sound that's in the front. So that is fronting of initial velar singles, and that should be disappearing around 4. And then let's go down to cluster reduction. So you'll see it says without S. So clusters without S, because S blends are later developing. So we're not talking about like words like snake, star, spy, none of those, swim, really just looking at clusters that are not involving the letter S as the first consonant. So if they're omitting one or more consonants in a sequence of consonants, so here's an example, grape. Grape becomes gape. Dropping that consonant sound is something that should disappear by age 4, unless it's an S blend. Those are still tricky and later developing, so it's not uncommon for children 4 and 5 to still have difficulty with S blends. All right, so in case some of you are here with a child who is 5 years old, or maybe your child is turning 5 soon and you're wondering, well, when should, other processes be disappearing after they're 4? Well, here's your answer. So we're going to look at this chart and just talk about the first couple of processes that we see illustrated here. I'm going to just pick a couple since there's so many. So let's talk about final consonant devoicing. So we're substituting, or a child is substituting a voiceless final consonant. So for example, the letter K versus the letter G. We talked about how K is voiceless and G is voiced, and they're both produced in the same place, right? Here in the throat. It's a velar sound, a back sound. So when they're substituting something that's voiceless, the word bag, for example, becomes back. Or even let's talk about the letters T and D, these tongue tip sounds. Tongue is going up to the back of the alveolar ridge, or just behind the teeth, there's a little bump, and the front teeth, your buccals here. So just behind the 2 top front teeth is a little bumpy ridge, and you can feel it with your tongue, and that's called the alveolar ridge. So when we produce the sounds for T and D, t, d, the placement is the same. The tongue tip is going right behind those 2 front teeth. And so what happens, T is voiceless and D is voiced. So what would happen is a child would use the letter T instead of the letter D. And so they would be devoicing. And so that is a process, again, that should be ending by age 5. All right, moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about speech intelligibility. And as you can probably guess, when children are younger and their sound system is, still expanding, they're not as intelligible as they are as when they go from being like 1 to when they become 5 and 6, right? So not only are they able to use their oral motor skills, more swiftly, more fluidly, to connect consonants and vowels as they're talking, they're also able to produce the sounds more clearly. So you'll see here that the intelligibility level increases from the time a child is 19 to 24 months from a range of about 25 to 50%. So in terms of what they're saying, how easy is it for you to decipher what they're really saying? How intelligible is their speech? That's what that range represents. And this is rough, rough estimation. So between the ages of 2 and 3, their intelligibility continues to increase. And so there should be about 50% to 75% intelligible. And I always think of, for example, an unfamiliar listener. Maybe it's a family member who lives out of state and you guys see each other around the holidays, and they notice that since the baby was 1.5 or even 2, now they're 3, and wow, I can understand him or her so much more. His speech is so clear. Oh wow, she's gained so many words and she's enunciating more. So the intelligibility increases. So between 4 and 5, somewhere between 75 to 90%, and over the age of 5, somewhere between 90% and 100%. And one thing I always point out is that a person's speech is never really 100% intelligible. Even during my presentation, I may mispronounce a word or have to correct a sound that I perhaps left off, or maybe it was just really not as clear or crisp as it could have been. So our speech is never 100% on point, accurate, but in terms of being intelligible and being able to understand what the person is saying, that is definitely up there between 90 and 100%. So now we're going to talk about the ages at which certain pronouns are starting to be used by a child. And one of the first 2 pronouns that children between 1 year to 2 years will use the pronouns I and it. Between 27 to 30 months, they're starting to incorporate additional pronouns like my, me, mine, and you. And between 31 and 34 months, you're starting to hear she and he, your, yours, and we. And as you can see, it just expounds. As they're getting older, they're starting to use a variety of different pronouns. And you'll see at over 47 months, that includes herself, himself, itself, ourselves, yourselves, and themselves. Dr. Chessie has a question, and the question is, how does this apply to someone who was previously tongue-tied? I'm not sure that I understand your question. In case anyone is wondering, so a tongue tie is when you have a little band underneath, down here at the bottom of your mouth. I won't show it to you, but there we go. I'll show it to you a little bit. That band there. So some children have a band that's like really short and tight. And because of that being the case, like in terms of that anatomy, the physiology or the function of that, in terms of them being able to reach their tongue up to produce a tongue tip sound, or even lick around their lips, all sorts of things, eating and drinking, it can impact speech sound production. And so what will often happen when a child is younger is they'll clip that, and that way it will kind of release that restricted movement. It will release the band a little, and so the child will have more range of motion. I hope I explained that in an easy way. So that is what the question is in regards to a tongue tie. But Dr. Chessie, I would love to dive deep with you during a consult and further answer that question. All right, so our next topic is morphology, and these are great questions. I love this involvement in the chat. Thank you so much, Dr. Chessie, for your participation. So morphology is very, very fun. Children are learning not only how to use more words, but they're learning how to incorporate word endings. So for example, you'll see in bold, ing, s, past tense ed, etc. I have another comment in the chat. Looks like a question. What if it sounds like they are breathing via their mouth, like a person with the cold? Very good question. I would definitely say speak with your pediatrician and see if perhaps they recommend a referral to an ear, nose, and throat doctor. It would be a good idea to have, perhaps, if your pediatrician recommends a referral, have the ENT to look inside to see what's happening. That is my recommendation if I were the parent of a child with what you're describing. I would definitely speak with my pediatrician and perhaps ask for a referral to an ear, nose, and throat doctor, a pediatric ear, nose, and throat, or ENT. Thank you so much. So regarding morphology, it's the study of how morphemes are put together. And you're probably wondering, what are morphemes? These are the smallest meaningful unit of language. And grammatical morphemes apply inflection that signals meaning to nouns, verbs, and adjectives. That sounds like really, really wordy, very verbose, right? But let's just look at the examples and make this a lot easier to understand. So between 19 and 28 months, an example of grammatical morphemes that are used by a child is present progressive ing. An example of that would be in the word crying, the ing at the end. So instead of baby cry, oh, sad, baby cry, maybe the baby or the child, I'm sorry, says, baby crying, oh, sad, baby's crying. Between 29 and 38 months, you're starting to see them use plural S. So instead of the word sock, they can identify that there's more than one. And so if they see 2, 3, 4 or more, they're adding an S to that to indicate that there's more than one. So they're using plural S. And then you'll see possessive S is starting to be used, for example, girl's hat. 39 to 42 months, you're seeing use of the be verb and present progressive ing. So the example here is the baby is crying. I'm just going to skip and pick one or two things from each row. And then as we look down further, when a child reaches somewhere between 43 to 46 months, we're starting to see that they're using irregular past tense words. For example, instead of she eat, she ate. And also articles. So using words like a, an, and the. They're starting to incorporate those when they're speaking. So the example here is a boy in the tree. And then last, we have 47 to 50 months. And we have examples of use of irregular third person singulars, such as she has it, and past tense be verbs, such as she was dancing. Talk next about mean length of utterance. And so when you hear that, sometimes it's abbreviated MLU, we're talking about the number of words that a child produces. So this is a chart showing Brown stages of language development. This is something very familiar and used by speech language pathologists, just to kind of see where a child falls in terms of the number of words they're using. So in stage 1, when a child is somewhere between 12 and 26 months, their mean length of utterance, or MLU, should be 1 to 2 words. And you can look in the far right and see what those milestones are. So using 1, 2, and 3 word utterances, using intonation to ask yes, no questions. So maybe they'll say milk, milk, and they're using that intonation to ask a question. And then the second phase, 27 to 30 months, maybe they're using, or no, they should be using 2 to 2.5 words. And so they're beginning to use grammatical morphemes, and they're using some early prepositional or spatial concepts like in and on. Oh my goodness, so many fun things you guys can do with in and on at that age. And then the third stage, when they're between 31 to 34 months, their MLU should be between at least 2.5 to 3 words. And so they're increasing in length, they're increasing use of WH questions, everything's starting to increase. Now, in the fourth stage, when a child is between 35 and 40 months, so like 3.5 years of age, you can kind of see how the MLU almost mimics the age of the child, but that is not what it's saying. So when they're between 3.5, they should have 3 to 3.25, 3.75 words, or 3.75 words. I just say 3 to 4. So basically they're using different combinations like object noun phrases. They're asking or using indirect and embedded WH questions. And in stage 5, when they're between 41 to 46 months, they're using between 4 to 5 words, like 3.5 to 5 words. And they're using very simple sentences. They're starting to use some more locatives or spatial prepositional concepts. And they're using and as a conjunction. So they're able to combine phrases. And then the last stage is 5 plus, and that refers to children between 47 months and up. And their MLU should be 4.5 words and more. So they're expanding and growing and language is exploding. And so they have more descriptive sentences at this point. All right, let's talk about pragmatics. Some of you may be familiar with that term. Perhaps you've heard the word social skills. Social skills and pragmatics are pretty much one and the same. And so between the ages of 3 and 4 years old, these are the milestones that children should be achieving. These are milestones that should be emerging. And so that includes following two-step related directions without cues. Taking turns and playing cooperatively with others, like children their age, relating personal experiences using their words, separating from their primary caregiver easily. But I will say, come on, going back to school and being in a new classroom or having a new teacher, being in a new building, it's hard. Every child's going to have a little trouble separating. But if this is something that's very, very regularly, this is something to watch out for in terms of social skills. Frequently practicing conversational skills by self-talking, or maybe like during play, talking to self. They're building a bridge, or they're building blocks, or they're playing with their figurines or their Legos, and they're just having scripted conversation just with the characters. That is an emerging skill. Beginning dramatic play, playing out whole scenes. I love dress up in a classroom. I get to hear so much language from children. And then showing frustration if not understood, starting to express their feelings. These are all milestones that they should have achieved between 3 and 4 years of age. So between 4 and 5, so a lot of your children who are 4 and turning 5, if you're in the room, this is kind of where you want to look to see, okay, are these skills that my child is starting to work on? Or maybe these are things I can work on with my child at home to help them to develop these milestones or achieve these milestones. So they're starting to follow 3-step directions without cues. And cues are like pointing or kind of giving hints of what it is that you're asking them to do. They're using direct requests with justification. So stop that, you're hurting me. Using words to invite others to play, playing different games, having good control of the elements of conversation, like starting to turn take. I talk, you say something. Oh, I can relate to that, and I relate. I love this last one. Speaks of imaginary conditions, such as what if, I hope. And, I think that is like a great way to do an activity with the child that age, using those prompts, like what would happen if, and just coming up with something, and you guys talk back and forth. All right, so pragmatics between 5 and 6, these are later developing, but children are starting to choose their own friends. They're asking meanings of words. They might be using threats or promises. And they're using topic shifts in their conversational speech. Let's talk about literacy. Ages 3 to 12 months, you'll see, here's some milestones, 1 to 2. This is what they should be doing between 2 to 3. Let's focus on 4 to 5. So 3 to 4. So if you have a kid who's just turning 4, they should be able to pay attention to the print, right? So while you're tracking and reading a story, they should be able to kind of follow along with you. They should recognize logos and pictures like, ooh, mama, bus. Identify some letters. Ooh, letter A. And they may be able to talk about the characters in the book. Oh, boy like me. If a boy, they may recognize something. Oh, his eyes are blue. I have eyes that are blue. Participating in rhyming games are things that children should be able to do. And liking or enjoying reading stories to him or herself. So even if they're making up the words, It's my favorite way to have a child read the book is for them to tell me what's happening by looking at the pictures. That's an emergent literacy skill. That's wonderful. So if they're able to do those things, they are on target. Let's talk about 4 to 5 years. So for 4 to 5 year olds, we want for them to understand story sequences. So let's talk about, for example, fables or fairy tales, the Three Bears, the Three Little Pigs. In those stories, there's somewhat of a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. Especially with early childhood books, there's typically a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so children should begin to understand the story sequence. And that is why a lot of times in preschool classrooms, you'll see a lot of picture scenes or, using felt boards and putting characters on and kind of telling the picture story to them visually so that they can associate the characters and the events and then can go back and retell the story using those felt boards. So this is an emerging skill. Knowing many letter names is as well, and using more letter-like forms than scribbles. So maybe, when they were younger and they were putting pencil to paper, there were more scribbles, but as they're getting older, you're seeing more things that look like O and L's and T's, and they're trying to create these letters that they're learning about. So by kindergarten, children are recognizing letters and letter sound. They can match what we call, grapheme, sound correspondence, phoneme, grapheme. So grapheme is the letter, phoneme is the sound, and they can hear the sound A or A and know that's letter A. They can hear the sound or see the letter B and know that B says ba. And then by end of kindergarten, I'm just watching my time, so sorry if I'm speeding up. By end of kindergarten, you'll see that they're starting to recognize some sight words. They're reading a few picture books from memory. I actually remember the first picture book I read from memory. And they're printing their first and last name. These are all emerging, right? And by end of kindergarten, they should have these. So I'm going to skip beyond some of these other age ranges. So first grade, we won't cover. So phonological awareness. This is all part of emergent literacy. Here are some skills and what they mean. So we'll start with syllable segmentation. That's being able to count the number of syllables in words. And I love making things fun. So we can be sing-songy while we're counting out the syllables in words. So in the word butterfly, 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 but how many syllables? Oh, 3, butterfly. Butterfly, that's right, it has 3 syllables. And you'll see some other examples here, like rhyming, identifying words that sound alike or rhyme. Which word rhymes with mat? Which word rhymes with hat? And maybe you're using picture cards, like flashcards that are rhyming cards, and you can put out, 2 words that rhyme and have a third one, a foil that doesn't rhyme. There's so many things you can do at home. A lot of these things that you can do with things you already have at home. Let's talk about some additional skills. Sound blending, the second row, blending sounds into a word after they are given separately. So what do you hear when I say b, at? I think about, I used this example last month, Sesame Street, when the monsters would have their letters up on the shelf and they would move the letters together, b, at, b, at. Bat, the word is bat. You can do that with blocks, letter blocks. You can do it on the refrigerator with letter magnets. There's so many wonderful things you can do at home during daily routines with your child. Let's talk about concepts next. So looking at the last row, we're going to hit a little bit on 3 to 4 and then talk about 4 to 5. So 3 to 4 years of age, they should be able at this age, children should be following quantity directions. Here's some examples of quantity words, empty and a lot, following equality directions like same and both. Which one is the same? Can you help me find same? Maybe I have 3 objects. Can you find same? Same, those are the same, you're right. Which one's different? Can you help me find different? And of course, they have to have an understanding of what same and different is. So these are just some examples of additional milestones for children between 4 and 5. So understanding comparative and superlative adjectives like big, bigger, and biggest. understanding time concepts like yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and understanding and being understanding and being able to identify positional concepts like first, middle, and last. And look at this chart. It is amazing how explosive vocabulary can be. Like, it just takes off, right? And there's exponential growth. So starting at 12 months, a child may have somewhere between 2 to 6 words. And looking at 24 months, a year later, 200 to 300 words. And let's look a year after that at 3 years, 1,000, 4 years, 1,600, somewhere around that number. And then at 60 months or 5 years, 2,200 to 2,500. The growth is exponential. And it's beautiful to see when language takes off with a child. Let's talk a little bit about questions. So answering questions, and this is an earlier age range, so we'll focus here, 3 to 4 and 4 to 5. So answering questions like who, why, where, and how, those are more complex. But the basic questions that they should be able to answer prior to that are questions like who, what, where, and what doing questions. Like, what's the baby doing? Oh, baby's sleeping. So as a child is growing older and their language is expanding, the hierarchy of questions that they're able to answer should also be growing and expanding. So answering when questions and how many questions. Looking at the last row, asking one word why questions. Why, mommy? But why, daddy? Grandma, why? Teacher, why? Why? I think it's brilliant that kids are starting to ask why. They may ask it a lot, but it's great that they're starting to ask more WH questions. And at 4 years, here are some types of questions using correct grammatical structure that they should be using. There's an example here of early infinitive questions like, do you want to? Future questions like, are we going to? And modal, can and may questions like, can you, may I? Listening skills, looking at that last row, between 3 and 4 years of age, children should be able to attend to their name being called from another room. So if you're in the kitchen and it's time for dinner and you say, Jacob, it's time to eat, they should be able to like attend to their name and come. Understanding simple WH questions. For example, again, those who, what, where, what doing questions. And looking at the very bottom, improving listening skills and beginning to learn from listening. And so attention and focus is required for that. And I feel like during the pandemic, that is something that a lot of our kids may have struggled with, especially if they were spending a lot of time on electronics or, watching more television. Being back in the classroom, it may be hard for them to maintain focus for longer periods of time. And then looking at this top row here for listening skills, attending to short stories, answering simple questions about it, repeating 4-digit numbers when they're given slowly, like 3, 5, 8, 2. Can you repeat those numbers back to me? 3, 5, 8, 2. Very good. So we'd love for you to follow us on social media at Home Tele SLP. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. I plan on talking some Rails this year and creating lots of wonderful YouTube videos, adding YouTube stories, lots of child reading storybook time stories to the YouTube channel. If you have any questions, you know how to reach me. Again, my name is Meredith Rose, and I'm the owner and founder of Home Tele SLP. Thank you so much for being here. And if you navigate to my website, those of you who had questions and wanted to schedule a free 30-minute consult, you can do that there. Thank you so much for attending.